Hello, and welcome to None of the Above. My name is Steve Nemerovski, and I'm your host. On None of the Above, we examine why the political system is dysfunctional and polarized, why it just isn't working. But on every show, we try and provide solutions. How we're going to get out of this cycle of dysfunction, how we're going to break the cycle of dysfunction, polarization, how we're going to make the system work. And as I said, we try to bring solutions. Today, we're going to bring some terrific solutions with an old friend, Eric Liu. He's the CEO of Citizen University. I'll refer you to an old show we did on Citizen University. He's already posted on YouTube. We're going to talk about that a little bit today. But also we're going to talk about Eric's new book, You're More Powerful Than You Think. You're More Powerful Than You Think. I want you to read this book, and hopefully our interview today with Eric is going to be a bit of a tease for you. But if you're interested in solving problems and you really want to know, how can I make a difference? You're going to read this book, and it's going to become your Bible sitting next to your bed. Well, you'll have two Bibles, your regular Bible and then your Eric Liu Bible. And then we're going to move ahead. Now, I got to warn you for today's interview, we're really not interviewing one person. I think Eric is really secretly 4 different people and they're evil twins or something, because you can't write as many books as he writes, be on TV as much as he's on TV, run Citizen University, run a similar outfit for the Aspen Institute, and do that all as one person. It's just not humanly possible. But we're going to talk to one of the Eric Lius today and talk about Citizen University and a great book, You're More Powerful. Well, he's more wonderful. You're more powerful than you think. Eric,
Steve,
welcome.
It's great to be here representing my fellow clones here.
Well, you also have youth on your side, so you must not sleep.
Oh, no, I get good sleep for sure. But it's great to be back with you, Steve.
So I do want to get to the book, because I think it's a terrific book. But just to catch up really quickly for my viewers, you have this wonderful organization, Citizen University. Let's do a few minutes on that. First of all, give us the elevator speech on what Citizen University is and why it was founded.
Yeah, well, we're a nonprofit that is based in Seattle, but we do work all around the United States. And our work is really about teaching the art of powerful citizenship, what it means to exercise power in everyday civic life. And we've got a whole portfolio of programs that are about teaching power. Sometimes it's with groups like veterans groups or immigrant groups or different local activist groups. Other times it's in partnership with K-12 educators and higher ed. But it's really trying to, actually, as my book does, break down the elements of power in civic life so that people can really think about this as something that you get fluent in, you get literate in power. And I think that idea of fluency and literacy in power is so fundamental to what it means to be a citizen today. So anyway, that's our work. And I also run, you alluded to it, a program out of the Aspen Institute that's a companion to that. It's a program on citizenship and American identity. And we've got a few projects there that are really about trying to unpack answers to this deep question of who is us today, in this change of demographics and all the anxiety and flux and the ways in which we're being pulled apart as a country, really trying to find some common threads of American identity. And so those two entities, my Aspen program and Citizen University, really work hand in glove on these broader issues of redefining our place and our role as citizens right now.
And it's a great mission. And again, we talked about Citizen University before, based in Seattle. But since our last interview, it seems like you've gone national. You've got Citizen University TV now, correct? And you're going to be doing a series of programs throughout the country, I understand, over the next year or two?
We are. We're launching something called Citizen Fest, which will be a series of festive gatherings around the country that are really about, again, making this topic of citizen power really accessible to everyday Americans. Not feel like you have to be a politico or some kind of political junkie or policy nerd or whatever, but just if you're a neighbor, if you're thinking about in the life of Aspen, Colorado, all civic power at every scale, whether you're talking about the United States Congress or the Aspen city government, all civic power boils down to this very simple question: who decides? Who decides, fill in the blank? Who decides whether we're going to have health insurance? Who decides whether we ought to have bike lanes? Who decides about zoning questions? Who decides about immigration policy? All these things at any scale, whether it's national or local, many Americans answer that question, who decides, with kind of a generic they, right? Well, they decided that bus service ought to change here. They decided that our water and sewer rates ought to go up. They decided that health insurance is not going to be available if you have these pre-existing conditions. And part of our work is really trying to drill down and unpack the meaning of that they. That they is in fact we. We decide, and we've got to learn actually how to be more engaged in actually running the machinery of government and policy making, so that those decisions end up actually reflecting the will of us, of we the people.
And again, it's a very powerful message, and I think you're doing an amazing job. And I think you've given us a nice segue to the book, but I don't want to segue yet without giving you a chance to do a quick commercial. Tell the viewers how to find the website, and tell them some of the really cool stuff posted on the website to get them involved.
You bet. So the website for the organization is simply citizenuniversity.us. And you'll find all kind of good stuff there. We create a lot of content. You mentioned some of it, a TV show that we run called Citizen University TV that really is a combination of laying out some of these ideas about power, but always coupling them with actual stories of local change makers, people who are organizing for change, whether it's local change on homelessness or change on immigration law or policy, whatever the issue might be. Everyday Americans who are just trying to write themselves into the story of who decides. We've also got a whole bunch of content on the website that is video from past conferences and convenings that we've run with really great civic innovators and catalysts from around the country. And then we've got just descriptions with some of our other programs. We launched a program, Steve, right after the election, the presidential election, called Civic Saturday. And this is a regular gathering that's kind of a civic analog to church or synagogue or mosque. It's not any of those things actually, but it really is about American civic religion, about the idea that there's a creed of ideas here that's supposed to bind us together. And what does it mean actually to practice that creed? And we have structured these gatherings rather intentionally to have something of the arc of a faith gathering. So we come together, we sing, we turn to your neighbor and you speak about a question, a common prompt. We hear readings of texts that you might think of as civic scripture, whether it's old texts like from the Constitution or the Federalist Papers, or new texts from Rebecca Solnit or Martin Luther King, whatever it might be. And then there's a sermon, and then we sing again. On our website, you'll find links to some of our past Civic Saturday gatherings with the sermons available there in text and sometimes in audio file. So just a real array of things, and then a lot of case studies of just individual change makers and collective change makers who remind us, again, back to the underlying theme of our work and the title of my book, you're more powerful than you think. And the idea that, oh gosh, I can't, who am I? I'm just one individual. I can't make a difference. When you start thinking that way, you are actually just completely giving away a whole store of civic power that you actually have every right to claim.
So I think you just answered the question, but I'm going to ask it again anyway. And again, for our viewers, the book is You're More Powerful Than You Think. We're talking to Eric Liu. You've got your Citizen University, you've got all your Aspen work, you're doing all this great work. Why did you need the book then? Why the book?
Well, the book, I think, is a real way to start to crystallize some of the ideas and some of the learnings that I've gotten. I mean, in my work, we work with people across the country, across different silos of civic work, whether it's civic technology, civic education, veterans, immigrant rights. But we also run the gamut ideologically. We have people in our network who are co-founders of the Tea Party, and then people who are co-founders of Black Lives Matter, people who are $15 Now advocates and activists, people who are at conservative think tanks and libertarian organizations. Our common thread here across all of that ideological diversity is if you're interested in exercising bottom-up citizen power, and if you recognize that we live in an age of bottom-up citizen power, then we want to play with you, right? That's our watchword. And so the book really crystallizes a lot of what I've learned over these last many years working with and collaborating with this incredibly diverse array of civic catalysts from around the United States. And I really felt like even though our organization, Citizen University, and as well as my Aspen Institute program, we create a lot of content, we create a lot of events around these topics. It's really helpful, both, frankly, for me, but also I think for people we encounter in the world, to codify some of our thinking about power so that it's not just a one-off event or a one-off story that's really inspiring about this environmental activist or that gun responsibility activist or whatever it might be, but you actually start to codify some basics about how to think about power, what power is, who has it, why that is, what laws of power there are that you ought to be paying attention to that play out every day in every scale of life. And so the book really is my attempt to codify some of this thinking and to really distill some of the best and most interesting stories of people who we, on a daily basis, get to work and play with.
And you mentioned, I think it's very important for the viewers here, notwithstanding perhaps that you lean more to the progressive side of the political spectrum, this book is written for anybody who's trying to solve a problem anywhere in the political spectrum. It doesn't matter where you're coming from. This is a how-to book, and it's really nonpartisan.
It is. I mean, it's actually, the way I put it is it's cross-partisan, right? I'm not pretending that people don't have partisan views, including myself. I'm a Democrat. My views are generally, as you say, left of center. I think part of what it means to be a grown-up citizen is not to have to pretend that you are the mythical creature called the neutral animal. We are humans. We have preferences. We have political and ideological leanings and affiliations. And I think part of being a grown-up citizen myself, but also in dealing with others, is to name that and own that, but then to say that doesn't keep me from actually learning from, working with, and indeed sometimes collaborating with people from other parts of the political spectrum. And so the book really tries to capture that spirit. And, the fact that, I tell stories in the book by people who run that wide gamut, but also have gotten praise for the book from people who run the gamut from, as I say, Tea Party to Black Lives Matter, underscores that that's a real big part of our whole approach to this topic.
So you focus a lot in the beginning of the book on power itself and the origins of power. So break this down, because I think you break down the 3 laws of power, what those laws are, and why it's important to understand those laws.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. I think it's really important to talk, when you're talking about citizen power, actually to define your terms. So let me just unpack. In the first place, when I say citizen, and that's in the context of everything, citizen university, citizenship, citizen power, I'm not talking only about documentation status under the immigration laws of the United States. I'm not talking about citizen in the paper sense. I mean a broader, more capacious ethical sense of being a member of the body, being a pro-social contributor to community, right? That's what I mean here when I'm talking about citizen. When I say power, I mean simply a capacity to ensure that others do as you would like them to do. Now, to some people, that sounds kind of creepy or menacing, but if we get real, again, about naming and understanding what's going on around us, the fact is that at every scale of our lives, whether our family relationships or neighborhood or community or more public and political, we as humans are always trying to get others to do as we would like them to do, right? I think part of the thing about life in the United States is we often have an allergy to naming or talking about power because the word feels kind of dirty and it seems like it's just a sordid topic. But one of the fundamental premises of my book is if you have qualms about talking about this topic, if you feel like, oh, that seems a little bit impolite to name or talk about power, then you've got to get over it. Because this is one of these moments right now where there's so much tectonic change in American politics that if you are being willfully ignorant and illiterate in power, then you're really part of the problem, right? And so that's my definition of terms in the first place. And when I talk about this notion of citizen power, I really describe in the book 3 simple laws of power that actually yield 3 imperatives for action. So law number 1, it's as plain as day to people, especially in these times, is that power concentrates, it compounds, right? And that's as basic as the rich get richer. People with some clout get more clout. People who get a little media coverage tend to get more media coverage. These things compound. Advantages compound, just as disadvantages compound. And powerlessness compounds and it concentrates as well. That's law number 1, and that is, as I say, about as plain a statement of reality as one can get in this age of nearly unprecedented inequality and concentration of wealth in the United States. Law number 2 is that power justifies itself. At every turn, incumbent holders of power, whether individuals or institutions, will spin elaborate narratives about why it ought to be that way, about why it's a God-given natural order of things that it is that way, about how it would be bad and bad for everybody else if that way changed, right? And these narratives, whether they are economic narratives like trickle-down economics or racial narratives like white supremacy, these are fairy tales and just so stories that are told by people who are holders of power to try to justify their power. So if all you had were these first two laws, that power is always concentrating and it's always justifying itself, you'd be in a pretty bad way. And what breaks us out of the doom loop of those first two laws is law number 3, which is that power is infinite. When I say power is infinite, I don't mean some kind of woo-woo notion that anybody can be as rich or powerful or as famous as they want just by manifesting it or thinking it. What I do mean is this, that in even highly unequal situations, even in political environments that seem incredibly stuck, and where one party seems to have really hoarded and monopolized power, even in those situations, it's entirely possible to generate brand new power out of thin air through the magic act of organizing. That organizing other humans, inviting 1 or 2 or 5 or 10 or 100 other people to join you in a common endeavor toward a common goal where you have to devise common strategies, that generates brand new power where it did not previously exist. And that really underscores the way in which power is infinite. And there are, in my book, just story after story. I open the book, actually, with a story of the tomato pickers of Immokalee, Florida, who were migrant farm workers held in conditions of basically indentured servitude near to slavery, who labored in obscurity for many decades, but then starting in the 1990s began to organize, began to say, we're not going to go pick unless you, the growers, actually give us heat shelters and start raising our wages a penny a bucket. And once they started tasting some of the fruit of those kinds of collective actions, they began to go even more widely up the food chain, so to speak, and not just put pressure on the growers who were employing them, but on the buyers, on the supermarkets and the fast food chains that were creating all this pressure to drive wages down to zero. And they started pressuring and shaming them and bringing in the media and bringing in all kinds of activists. And within a few short years, these illiterate and power illiterate tomato pickers of Immokalee, Florida, had completely unended a giant sector of the agricultural economy in the United States. They'd created a fair food code that major chains agreed to abide by. They'd gotten their wages raised. And I open the book with the story because it's pretty hard to think about a more unequal balance of power than the tomato pickers of Immokalee, Florida, and yet they did it. They proved that power is infinite by organizing, and if they could do it, we can too. And that's really a big part of the message of the book. And for all of these 3 laws, there's an imperative for action, which I can talk about a little bit more, Steve. But I think that's the way that I try to lay out how we have to think in the first place about power with clear eyes and a willingness to confront the topic.
And when I'm teaching my class at Columbia, I bring in a representative from Ai-jen Poo's group, the domestic workers, a woman named Barbara Young, and she talks about coming, I think, from Dominican Republic or Haiti, and how these group of domestic workers, took on the whole bureaucracy in New York and passed their law. So we clearly know it can be done, but I think your book points out that in order to do it, though, you have to approach it in the right way. You have to take on reasonable solutions. You got to have reasonable time frames. And I think what message would you give to people in that regard? In other words, because I know so many people start out and they're well intended, but they try and solve an 800-pound gorilla right out the door, when what they should be solving is maybe a 2-pound, and to move on to a 10-pound and to a 50-pound, and then they're ready to take on the 800-pound gorilla.
Well, actually, I'm not totally sure I agree with that characterization. I mean, I think it depends on the circumstances. There are some circumstances where incrementalism does make sense and it's the right way to go. Frankly, there are other circumstances where you ought to be trying to lift or move the 800-pound gorilla, and that you ought to be expanding the frame of the possible and widening the parameters of the arena of the battlefield, even if you know that it's unlikely that you'll win this first time, just to begin to push people's thinking. So I think, in the book I talk about how each of those 3 laws that I described a moment ago yields an imperative for action. So if in the first place power is always concentrating into these monopolized winner-take-all games, then our first imperative is to change the game, right? So if you encounter a situation where the game of power, for instance, the way the NRA dominates state legislatures around the country and the United States Congress, they play a really effective inside game, right? And if you are trying to fight the inside game and trying to work the machinery of legislation to get gun responsibility legislation going, that's hard going. But what we learned in Washington State, where I live, is that sometimes it's better to change the game by bypassing the inside game of the Capitol altogether and expanding it to a much wider outside game of going straight to the people. I live in a state, and you're in a state right now, Steve, where we have tools of direct democracy available to us. And so in Washington, when we got bottled up in the legislature trying to create a system of universal background checks for gun purchases, we actually just went to the people and put a measure on the ballot statewide. And the people were, of course, in favor of this common sense measure. It was only in a small closed-door Capitol arena that the NRA was able to cow a handful of legislators into blocking and stopping the legislation. And so sometimes you got to change the game. But if in the second place, power is always trying to spin narratives of self-justification and telling you why the people who have, and the people who have not, then our second imperative is to change the story, right? And I talk a lot about this in the book. I think narrative is a huge part of what it means to exercise citizen power. And if you think about the way in which we're all talking these days about the dreamers, about young undocumented immigrants who were brought to the United States as children, and how most Americans today feel like there ought to be a fair deal for dreamers, a reasonable pathway to citizenship for them. That's the fact that we're all talking about that is the product of a concerted campaign by immigration reform activists to change the story. That this was not a story in the way that Donald Trump was telling about illegals who are criminals and rapists and so forth, but that this is a story about people who are our friends, our neighbors, our family members, who are blameless and who are part of our community and who are contributors to our community, right? That's a changing of the story that has changed the parameters of immigration politics in the United States. And then in third place, finally, Steve, if power is infinite and not zero sum, but so many people remain stuck in this equation where they think it's finite and zero sum, then our imperative is to change the equation, right? And the way we do that is by organizing and by activating webs and networks of mutual aid. You talked about the National Domestic Workers Alliance. To me, that's a perfect example. Here's a realm where individual domestic workers, nannies and caregivers, often immigrant women of color, are working literally in isolation, household by household, and often getting abused, wage theft, sexual abuse, all kinds of inappropriate work circumstances. And for many, many years, domestic workers have had to suffer that in silence and isolation. But the National Domestic Workers Alliance changed the equation by creating a platform on which these individual isolated domestic workers could web up and band together and start exchanging stories of what they were experiencing, and then bring to bear their collective power to apply pressure on policymakers to change and set what in many states now are domestic workers' bills of rights. That's a total changing of the equation. And so game, story, and equation. If you think about changing those three things, that really helps crystallize and simplify what seems like a vast and complicated array of things of what it means to engage in civic life. And in my book, I talk about a bunch of strategies that fall under each of those three categories.
So I think the book's a great book, for the understanding of power and the understanding how to break down power. One of my concerns, though, Eric, and you don't really deal with it in the book, but I think you imply it, is how do we do this in an appropriate tone? The tone today is not a civil tone, and I'm afraid that the level of discourse just takes away from the message at the start, and you can't even hear the person if they're yelling at you, or they're calling you names that are totally inappropriate. You can't even get there.
Yeah, I think you make a good point. I think there's two things, though, that I would say about this that are distinct. Speaking about distinct parts of the problem that we're facing right now. You're right that we're in an age of incredible polarization and tribalism, and where the natural reflex is what my friend C. Terry Warner, a great retired philosophy professor at BYU, talks about this dynamic of accuse to excuse. I accuse you to excuse me, right? That cycle plays out so much in partisan politics today, where nobody's taking responsibility. And so, anytime an issue comes up, the answer is, well, you did worse, or you did something even more horrible. And that whole approach of accuse to excuse is is not productive, and it's leading to the kind of dysfunctional politics that we have. That said, there's something else I want to say, though. I do not worship at the altar of civility. I would prefer that our debates be more civil. I would prefer that they be humanizing. But I think, if you look at the United States Senate, up through the period of Jim Crow till the Civil Rights Movement, it was a very genteel and civil institution. And it, through all of that gentility and civility and through all of the politeness of their debates, it was an institution that steadfastly refused to allow equal civil rights for African Americans. And so civility is not the same as justice. And if I have to choose between them, I'd rather have justice. And sometimes the fight for justice requires an uncivil tone. Now, I'm an absolute advocate of nonviolence. I'm not talking about violence, but I do think that protest is appropriate, and making noise is appropriate. Disrupting what seems to be the polite order of things is sometimes wholly appropriate. Now, that's separate from pure tribalism, and it's separate from just, hey, you're a Republican or you're a Democrat, you must be the devil. I think, I've taken great pains both in our work at Citizen University and the Aspen Institute, and just in my own life as an individual citizen, to build some bonds of trust and affection with people whose politics are quite different from mine. And that's been, one of the things you'll find on our website at citizenuniversity.us are links to some clips of me and Glenn Beck in conversation. I went on Glenn Beck's TV and radio show, and of course, you can't find two people with more, widely divergent politics, and yet we've been able to really establish some basis for rehumanizing our politics, just the two of us, and learning how to disagree well. The last thing I'll say, Steve, is that, to your point, and I know this is the point of your show, is to get us all past the acrimony and the bitterness of modern politics. My program at the Aspen Institute on Citizenship and American Identity has launched a new project with a nonprofit called Facing History and Ourselves, a great education nonprofit, and the Allstate Corporation is supporting it. And it's called the Better Arguments Project. And the premise of this project is that what we need in American civic life today isn't necessarily fewer arguments, it's just less stupid arguments that we need, right? And I don't mean to be glib. When I say less stupid, I don't mean just less name calling. I mean recognizing that all of American civic life is an argument. All of American civic life revolves around a set of core tensions between a Hamilton view of strong central government and a Jefferson view of strong local government, between liberty on the one side and equality on the other, between color blindness and color consciousness, between pluribus and unum. These tensions have been with us from the founding. And what it means to have a better argument is whether you're arguing today about the Affordable Care Act, or whether you were arguing 50 years ago about civil rights law, or 75 or 80 years ago about the New Deal, we're always having the same arguments. And what it means to have a better argument is to be able to situate what we're arguing about today in a sense of our country's history, in this tug of war between competing ideals, and finally in the recognition that you can't ever have final victory, that all of American political life has to be a matter of give and take, and a matter of compromise, and a matter of hybrid making, where you take some of the ideas from the left and some of the ideas from the right. That if we ever had a situation in American politics where one side did actually achieve final victory, quote unquote, and people who were strong libertarians finally triumphed and completely vanquished people who cared about social equality and justice, we would have a chaotic society, just like the same would be true vice versa, right? It's all about the tension and finding that healthy, creative tension. That's a big part of American life, is how to have better arguments.
Eric, as always, I never have enough time to talk to you. I hope the next time you're in Aspen, you can let me know ahead of time. We can get you back in the studio and continue our conversation. You're a great guest, great book, and I wish you all the best.
Steve, thank you so much for having me. It's been really fun to talk with you.
We've been talking to Eric Liu, who's written a great book, You're More Powerful Than You Think. Also the head of Citizen University. Again, we recommend you to their website. I always talk about solutions. I think Eric's the kind of guy that has a solution each day. So find Eric, find his book, find Citizens University, get involved. Remember, if you're not part of the solution, you are part of the problem. Thank you.